Okay. Lesson 6, Truth and Reconciliation in the Workplace. This video is about truth and reconciliation. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we're referring to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and to their final report, which they published in 2015. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC for short, was born out of a legal settlement between residential school survivors and the parties responsible for establishing and operating the residential schools, including the federal government and various churches. The TRC's goal was to inform Canadians about what happened in residential schools. For more than a century, Indigenous children were taken away from their families and forced to attend these schools, where they had to abandon their own languages and cultures and adopt Euro-Canadian languages and cultures. The schools were funded by the Canadian government and run by nuns and others church officials who wanted to convert the children. Residential schools were overcrowded and underfunded. The children in these schools were malnourished and had a disease like influenza. Children were regularly abused, physically and sexually. Of the 150,000 children who attended residential school, at least 6,000 never returned home. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to make sure Canadians would know the truth about what happened, so they'd be able to start working toward reconciliation. The term reconciliation refers to the process of repairing a relationship, in this case, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, whose government destroyed this relationship. Now, I'd like to pass it over to Vince, who's going to talk about the TRC's final report.
The TRC's final report is a document outlining 94 calls to action. It informs all Canadians about the history of Canada's residential school system, the impact it had on Indigenous peoples, and the reparations that need to be made. The TRC itself was a probe into the history and the impact of the residential school system in Canada, bringing forth 94 recommendations to repair and reconcile Canada's commitment to the integrity of the treaty and to the welfare of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Most of the 94 recommendations are for the Canadian government. However, some of them, like 92, are for businesses. TRC number 92 goes like this. We call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations and Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to incorporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following. 1. Commitment to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free and prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. 2. Ensure that Aboriginal peoples have the equitable access to jobs, training, and educational opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. 3. Provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relationship. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. The best way to advance reconciliation in your workplace is to implement these calls to action and any other that may affect your organization, because some calls to action are specific to certain industries, for example, law, healthcare, and/or education.
Working to advance reconciliation is a non-negotiable if you want to build an inclusive culture in your organization. When you avoid this work, you do it half-heartedly. Indigenous employees and candidates, or Indigenous-led organizations you might be interested in partnering with, they can tell. There's a good chance they're going to. And there's a good chance they're going to go find another organization that does prioritize this work. And you're going to lose the opportunity to work with them. You're probably also going to lose the opportunity to work with their allies and other organizations that value equity and inclusivity. Now, let's talk about our other two JEDI groups: persons with disabilities and racialized newcomers. In their final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission addressed the need for solidarity between Indigenous peoples and newcomers, something the JEDI Hub has always felt very strongly about. Given that we've prioritized both Indigenous peoples and racialized newcomers in our work. So, here's what the Commission wrote. For new Canadians, many of whom carry their own traumatic memories of colonial violence, racism, and oppression, finding common ground as treaty people involves learning about the history of Aboriginal peoples and finding ways to build stronger relationships of solidarity with them. The Commission believes there is an urgent need for more dialogue between Indigenous peoples and new Canadians. As for disability, our third JEDI lens, let's consider the needs of employees who are both disabled and Indigenous. So, what do they need in order to succeed? This is going to vary from person to person, depending on their nationhood and disability. The best thing you can do in these situations is ask. So just ask them what they need in order to feel included and succeed at their role. This brings us to the end of Lesson 6. Thanks for watching. To learn more about truth and reconciliation, I recommend reading the TRC's final report, linked in our PDF.